Because you can't know exactly what everything is ambiguous. Nearly all ethics is based on the proposition that if you do something good, then something good will turn up. And so one of the things I was trying to figure out is what happens when you actually do have a radically uncertain, radically ambiguous world in terms of action.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality on Future Framed TV. I'm your host, Paul Mason, and this is part of a collective podcast series for Traces&Dreams. And we're doing a little special series here, interviewing authors from an edited volume on the Anthropology of Ambiguity. And I'm joined today with Professor Jonathan Marshall. Welcome and thank you for coming.
Yeah, I don't know, it sounds trivial, but I am not a professor, so yeah, okay.
In many countries, they would consider you professor, so we'll enlarge the definition. I'm actually just trying to cover up my mistake as well. So
see, ambiguity. Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Okay. And Jonathan, thank you for entertaining my mistakes. But let us learn a little bit more about you. What brought you to the topic of ambiguity?
I've been interested for a very long time in the way that people try and impose order on the world, and the way that the order that they impose actually creates the problems that they want to avoid. Particularly, this was noticeable to me when I was working online social control. And quite obviously, the ways that people try to impose social control and tries to put order and politeness and stuff actually provoked people into being rude, okay, or being aggressive or flaming or whatever. So the system that they used didn't work. Now I was kind of taken by that to look at the way that people wrote software, and also why software never worked. And that was partly because of the methods that we used to try and make it work. And one of the sort of interesting things was that everybody would say sort of something along the lines of, oh, this doesn't work because of this and whatever, but they would never do anything to actually change the process. One of the reasons was that management often considered that they knew the jobs that people did. They actually had no idea whatsoever. And so they would say that software has this requirement, and so on. And it would actually not have anything to do with what anybody was actually trying to use the software for. And it was just considered too much work to actually go and ask people what it was that people needed or what they would like to be improved. So basically, the system of control of management or whatever produced complete messes all the time and quite regularly. I was trying to explain how this works. And some of the reason was that most social systems are complex systems. And complex systems have a lot of properties, but they do share various things. Like, it's not possible to actually know everything about a complex system. The only model of the system is the system itself. And this causes a lot of confusion in people. Like, for instance, we're not very good at predicting the weather tomorrow or whatever. It's quite frequently wrong. And yet we are predicting trends, which is like climate change will get worse. And people say, oh, you can't predict the weather. How can you predict the trend? We're actually pretty good at predicting trends, but we can't predict specific events. Essentially, everything in the world is ambiguous. We don't know enough about it to say what it's going to do. I mean, think about it. Even a conversation, however well planned you are, you have no idea what's actually going to eventuate from that conversation. And in many ways, that's what makes conversation interesting, because you have no idea where it's going to go. And, you could end up in a death feud for all you know, but it's improbable, but it's possible. Because you can't know exactly what everything is ambiguous. And so part of the thing that I try and look at in the paper in the book and elsewhere is what that does to ethics. Because nearly all ethics is based on the proposition that if you do something good, then something good will turn up. And so one of the things I was trying to figure out is what happens when you actually do have a radically uncertain, radically ambiguous world in terms of action. Right? So again, say we all agree that climate change is bad. What we then do about that is a continual process of being uncertain about what we do. Now, this is why I argue that all politics has to be experimental, and it takes time to work out through the situation what you've actually done or achieved or whatever. But you have to be constantly correcting. There's no possibility of controlling the world, and there's no possibility of being right always in advance. A classic example is neoliberalism, which says if you have a free market, then everybody will have liberty and prosperity and so on. And of course, we should largely know by now this does not actually happen because of unintended consequences, like setting up the conditions for plutocracy, and setting up the conditions where people try and manipulate the market for their own benefit, and the whole thing fails. So you get an incredibly, to use the Marxist term, alienated society that arises out of this. And your good intentions matter nothing because you didn't know how it was going to work. And you assumed a dogma that if you have a free market, then everything will work out fine for every situation, and it will provide the best solutions possible.
That was such a juicy intro. I was really caught by the phrase, the rules are constantly being broken by reality.
Yeah.
And I really liked the metaphor of a conversation. You like, I knew I was going to have a conversation with you this morning, but I had no idea the conversation was going to be steered in so many fascinating directions. I ask people a question and I never know where they're going to take the answer. So
Yeah.
I'm going to brace
Yeah.
myself right now. And I'm going to ask you, what is normal?
That is actually a really difficult question to answer. Because if you take complexity seriously, then there is no long-standing normality.
Yep.
Okay, because the system is constantly in flux.
Yep.
Some people like Alfred Whitehead, who didn't know about complexity but knew about process, actually suggested that the laws of the universe may change as it goes through the process of being. I don't know. Okay, obviously none of us have lived that long, but nevertheless, it's important to think of that. So normality, in a way, doesn't exist. Normality is just the habits that you have built up and the conventions about what you will expect to happen. And we know enough about social change to note that change can happen incredibly rapidly, and it can be incredibly disorienting, and then it becomes incredibly normal. I mean, like everybody assumes that they have mobile phones that can record things. We assume that we can actually talk to each other online. I mean, when I started online, this just stuff wasn't possible. You had to use text for everything, which, there's a plus and a minus to that. So we can get used to things very quickly. And one of the things that I worry about in climate change is that we will start thinking, 50 degrees days, that's just what happens in summer. People die in streets of heat exhaustion. That's just what happens in summer. I mean, you can tell that sort of thing is quite normal because when people say go and live in England for a while, they suddenly start thinking it's really hot at 15 degrees C.
You said some really interesting theoretical things that I might pick up on a bit later, but while we're on the topic of politicians and climate change, you're kind of describing the Australian response when we were under the Liberal government, under Scott Morrison, where there was a lot of climate change denial. And then when we had the rampant bushfires in 2019 that people were directly correlating to as a consequence of climate change, suddenly this party that had a lot of climate change denial suddenly flipped around and said, well, that's the new normal.
Yeah. Or they just said, we've always been like this. We didn't have the intensity of the fire. Sure, fires have been widespread throughout Australian history, but fires which actually more or less burnt forests down and burnt forests that had never been touched as far as we can tell in geological history, because they were so damp and so wet, the fires in Tasmania and Queensland and stuff like that. They just said, oh, well, that's the way it is. And it's kind of like crazy. No, that's not the way it's been. I mean, this is not normal, but we pretend it's normal. These stresses all mount up. Like, say there was another flood in Lismore next year. Let's hope there isn't. But they still wouldn't have recovered from the two previous floods. So it's going to be even worse.
Makes people even more at risk and even more vulnerable. I
yeah.
I want to pick up on a phrase you said because you said people pretend it is normal. And if I was to change that
Yeah.
phrase a little bit, I found it really interesting that you said there's normal doesn't exist. Like it's not in.
Yeah.
If you look at complexity theory, if you look at process theory, normal doesn't exist. And then when we think about the concept of normal, we can apply it to daily habits and conventions. But if normal doesn't exist, why would we apply it to habits and conventions? And could we change the phrase that you said that people pretend that it is normal? We get accustomed to something and we pretend that this is normal now. And can I change that phrase to perhaps say people pretend that there is a normal, that normal exists at all. We pretend it exists.
Basically, human beings have a pattern making facility in the head, the brain, the soul, whatever you want to say. Okay. And we see patterns that are not there all the time. People see patterns in ink blocks. People see patterns in, random scratches on bark. They see patterns in the clouds. We see patterns, and that's kind of vital for our ability to actually survive in the world. But we do it when it's also not there. Whatever happens in reality, we will tend to see there as being a pattern. We will connect disconnected things. We will ignore all the other stuff that happens because pattern seeing is a filter. Right. Again, it's the point that complexity cannot be observed directly. Sometimes this is really, really good, really, really useful, and sometimes it's delusional. I happen to have quite bad sight, so I see things that are not there all the time until I look at them and they dissolve. Right. That's just the way it is. So I'm quite used to living in a hallucinatory environment. But, we want to be able to predict what will happen next. I mean, this seems to be a vital thing. So consequently, the events that are happening, we tend to group into patterns. Some of those patterns are probably real. Some of those patterns are probably not real, but they're based on our repeated experience. And we tend to select various events that we think that we've made repeat, if you like, by looking for them, until the world looks like it's reasonably stable. And lots of the world is stable. I'm not going to suddenly start falling upwards or whatever. But nevertheless, an awful lot of the ordering of the world is something that we do together with other people in interaction.
That's a really great summary of how our minds are pattern-seeking devices, and that, with our forebrains, we want to be able to predict events in the world based on the patterns that we piece together. And that, being an anthropologist, there's also an understanding that that pattern-seeking device is culturally conditioned.
Yeah.
And your work takes that understanding of human cultural behavior and considers it within the context of ethics, complexity, certainty, false certainty. What insights are you finding in relation to very practical or grounded topics like Australian politics and climate science?
One of the inherent problems that we've had is, as I say, convincing people that climate is changing. And some of that is because so far it hasn't changed very rapidly. And even nowadays, people will tell me it's not changing at all. And yet, it's been quite a while now since effectively the hottest 8 out of 10 years have not been, the last 8 out of 10 years or whatever. Okay. Because they're getting used to it, and it's not a problem. One of the real problems, I think, is that when we try and do remedies, we don't think in terms of the complexity of those remedies and the effects that they have on the world. I mean, you get either people saying there are problems with renewable energy, in terms of mining, in terms of putting together, and so on, but they don't see that if we don't do this, this will also be a problem. The solution of renewables is a fraught solution, but it is a better solution than continuing to burn coal or gas, which will be disastrous. Okay, but again, you cannot point to specific stuff and say this will be disastrous unless you say something like living near a coal power station, you're much more likely to get lung disease. But you can't sort of say this particular coal station causes this particular effect. Okay, that's the complexity stuff. So you can only say that in general, coal burning or gas burning produce specific effects. And of course, many people will not find that persuasive because there's no direct causal link between a particular thing and another particular thing. One of the really strange things about the coalition's nuclear policy, for me, is that they appear to have absolutely no sense of the system at all, or the systems. They are saying that we 7 nuclear power stations, some of which will be non-existent SMRs, small modular reactors, which will not replace the coal stations that are going out of business, right? So it doesn't even replace the coal that we've got. The only way that we can continue through nuclear reactors with that small number is by increasing emissions. Right? You have to increase emissions, otherwise the electricity supply will crash. Prices will go up through the ceiling because of demand. It will be a complete and utter mess, and you will not get, in any case, you will not get zero emissions by 2050. Right? What is the only reason that we have to change our energy supply? And that is to lower emissions. So if we're if we're spending billions upon billions, these things, are about $9 billion each, right? So that's 63 billion for 7. We're spending $63 billion to do nothing to reduce emissions, which is the only reason that you'd possibly want nuclear in the first place. Right. And they apparently, they rave on about how bad Labour is about spending. And then they have a totally useless, massive amount of money spending project that will not deliver the results that they claim it will deliver. And it's obvious that it won't deliver what the results that they claim it will deliver. And of course, they are stopping large-scale renewable projects as part of this, because you don't need them anymore, they say, but you do.
It's funny, 10 years ago, James Lovelock, the inventor of the Gaia hypothesis, wrote a book called The Revenge of Gaia. And he said, in that book, he was putting forward the argument that nuclear energy would buy us a 50-year patch to help us transition to renewable technology. And you're picking up on something in what you're saying. You're picking up on something that is part of the pushback against renewables, and that is that they are a fraught solution.
Yeah.
Do you think the popular thinking or public thought about fraught solutions is wedded to our ideas of purity?
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, we once you've decided that the world can be simply explained, then you want simple solutions. Right? So the idea, I mean, what I get really annoyed about with renewable people is that they're saying we are going to install renewables to save the environment. We have all these protesters saying, we don't like what you're doing to the environment here. And you say, oh, idiots. No, I mean, it may be wrong-headed of them or whatever, but it's not what you want is people to have a relationship to their environment. And then you're telling them that they can't have it. That, if we don't have a relationship to our environment, then we are really stuffed. Okay. Now, and the primary, in my opinion, right, the primary relationship that we have to environment when we are not deeply dependent upon it for survival, like we're not doing the traditional thing of looking for berries and fruit and roots and animals and stuff like that, is the aesthetic thing, right? And again, that goes to pattern thinking. You see a particular pattern in the world, and most of the time when the pattern is disrupted, it is a forebringer of something disastrous happening. You know that the environment is going to collapse or something dreadful is going to happen. So it's a perfectly reasonable thing for people to object to large-scale renewables. The question becomes then, how do you steer around the objections as best you can? In my opinion, one, you cannot do that through capitalism, because the whole point of capitalism is to make profit and do it as cheaply as possible. Right? So they're not concerned about what locals feel about the land, because that's a cost. Right? So what I would suggest is the best solution for this sort of thing is local level renewables, community renewable energy, where the community itself has the input into the choice of where the renewable farms go, of what happens to the energy. I mean, in most places, for instance, with capitalist renewables, the locals don't even get any energy from the renewable farm, right? It's sent somewhere else. So as far as they're concerned, their environment is being wrecked for the benefit of other people, right? But if they actually have control over where the electricity goes, then, for instance, they can then instead of sending the money off to a distant electricity company, they can spend it in their locale. They can support development. They can support jobs for young people. They can do whatever they like, right? And they will, if it's wired up properly, they will be more resilient in terms of climate change. Like when the power cables went down in South Australia.
Do you think resilience goes hand in hand with capitalism?
No. I mean, because capitalism aims for maximum efficiency to make maximum profit. And without redundancy, no system is resilient.
And as you're talking about this, it makes me think that, capitalism profits from vulnerability.
Yeah.
And not giving people agency.
There's the old psychological cliche that if people were satisfied, then they wouldn't be consumers.
Yeah.
So you have to create dissatisfaction in order to keep consumption going.
Yeah.
Obviously, I can't talk very much, but anyway.
With all the books behind you?
With all the books behind me, yeah.
But books are always something lovely to share. So, and I can tell by the way,
absolutely.
I can tell by the way that they're stacked that you visibly share your books.
Well, yes, to as much extent as I can. Anyway, but capitalism essentially runs efficiently, so it cannot. There's a software engineer whose name I've forgotten at the moment, who talks a lot about Slack and how you have to have more stuff in your software and how you've got to actually get programmers to program without pressurizing them so that they can't actually think about what they're doing. And I think this is a vital principle to life, that you should have lots of excess over what you need so that you can then be resilient in tough times.
What questions do you think we should ask about resilience?
The obvious problem is, right, you can never tell whether you're resilient or not until the crisis comes, right? However, I think you can ask yourself, Okay, what would I do if my electricity went down? Okay, and that may then convince you, oh, I need solar panels for when that happens, or I need one of those small vertical wind turbines or something like that to get some kind of energy going. And probably need a battery for storage, whatever. Okay, you can also ask, what would happen if, for instance, somebody I was reading the other night was saying basically that world trade occurs because the Americans spend so much money on protecting the seas so that the trade routes can exist. Right?
Mm,
What would happen if you really got a strong isolationist president who said, we're not going to do that anymore? How would you get around that? I mean, obviously, China would do some stuff. We would probably do some stuff. Japan would do stuff. But it would have to be coordinated at a world level and stopped from becoming a form of piracy come exploitation. And there's quite a lot of stuff that is depends on really kind of simple things like, are you living in a place where you could get food for a couple of days if food wasn't coming in? Do
mm.
you have food in your growing in your garden? You don't need much, but again, those sorts of things are questions that are about resilience. And that's why I think it's really important, particularly for country towns, to have community renewable energy, probably have community gardens, because it may not be the case that everybody is, all the local farmers are growing enough food that you require every day to be able to support that area,
Mm.
and so on. And we need to think about things like that, especially given that climate breakdown is likely to get worse. So it's a matter of asking what doesn't work or what is likely to not work.
Dr. Jonathan Marshall, this conversation has been so interesting, and I could certainly ask you more questions, and this could go for hours. And I want to thank you for your time and
Pleasure.
thank you for your insights. And thank you for joining us on Idioms of
Well, thank you
Normality.
for being a good interviewer.
And the name of the chapter in this edited volume that you've authored is Ambiguity in
Oh, you
Politics.
expect me to remember things like
The
that?
I'll tell the audience, don't worry. Ambiguity in Politics,
Yeah,
the
okay.
suppression of complexity in Australian governmental responses to climate change.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's, I should also say, it's a lot about Simone de Beauvoir and Martin Buber, just in case that was the main interest that someone might have.
I should have mentioned that as well. There was I did have some, I did prepare a few questions here and there, but I rarely end up going to them for
Yeah,
those reasons. But it's one of the joys, like you said, of we might know that we're going to have the conversation, but we don't know where the conversation will go. Once
yeah.
again, thank you very much for your
Thank you
time.
very much, too.